Welcome to Books in Action. I'm Jim Horton. Our guest is Maplewood resident Pamela Erens, former editor at a women's magazine and fiction writer whose work has appeared in many places. She is the recipient of 2 fellowships from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. Pamela's novel, The Understory, has recently been published by Ironweed Press, and it is that book we are discussing today. To begin, Pamela, tell us more about your background. How does one move from being a magazine editor to a fiction writer? That seems like a long leap.
It really wasn't. I was one of those kids that was always scribbling. I've always written stories. Before I could write stories, was the kind of kid that would foist my stories orally on other people, my mother, anyone. And even when I was working as a magazine editor, I wrote fiction on the side, and I wrote a great deal of journalism on the side. And I'm just one of those people that loves words, and anything I can do with them makes me happy, whether I'm editing them, whether I'm writing journalism, personal essays. I've written poetry. So when I left the magazine world about 10, 11 years ago, I just found that I could ramp up the time that I was writing fiction.
So in your education, did you concentrate on journalism and writing all the way through?
Not in my college education. I was a literature major, so I concentrated on reading a lot of wonderful literature, and the writing was always a hobby, and fortunately and wonderfully it grew slowly from a hobby to something I actually pursued more seriously.
That's great. Let's turn now to your novel, The Understory. It's a narration by a character who is cut off emotionally and almost in every other way from the rest of the world. He's living illegally in an apartment that he took over from his deceased uncle 15 years prior. He hasn't touched anything in the apartment, from what I could tell. He hasn't moved a chair. The novel examines him in a life-changing crisis in his life, actually probably 2 or 3 crises in his life at the climax. Tell us about this character, Jack Frederick Ronan Gorse, who seems trapped in his life and unable to get out.
Well, he's 40 years old at the time of the book events, and he has lived all his life in New York City and grown up very affluent on the Upper East Side with cultured parents who had art and music and books in the home. And he's one of those people that starts out as a bright kid with a lot of focus, and somehow the things he focuses on begin to take over his life and crowd out the ability to relate to other people. And by the time we get to the story opening, the year that this book follows, he has really retreated into a world very much of his own making.
And he's been in that world for quite some time.
For quite some time.
So his patterns are very well set. It seems to, like in the book, he almost does the same thing every day in the same way.
Right.
Right. Is it fair to say that the name of the novel, The Understory, is a pun referring both to him as a dropout as well as the plants in the Central Park ramble?
I think that's true, and I even think it has more meanings. There's the meaning of the story behind the story. When the book opens, you know something dramatic has happened, but you don't know quite what it is. And he fills in the story behind the events. So there was that meaning of the title in my mind. And there's also the idea of the people who live in a little more unseen way in a large city, who are doing things and experiencing things that we don't always see, that isn't the public face of the city. So I had that in mind also.
But it also refers to his intense interest in botany.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Why did you choose the Central Park ramble? That almost has a significance that maybe I didn't quite grasp in the book, but it seems like it's alone, it's set apart. Is that the reason why you chose that particular section of Central Park?
That's part of it, and part of it, it's just beautiful. I love Central Park, and I used to, when I lived on the Upper West Side, I walked every morning to work in Midtown through the park. So I took many of those walks that Jack takes. Now, I didn't spend my whole day there. I actually had a job, unlike Jack, and I walked through the park there, but I love it, and there was a part of me that was drawn to celebrate the park, and the Ramble in particular because it's the most wild, it's the least populated. It's not where the rollerbladers are and the people who are dancing with a hat out for money. It's a beautiful wooded. You can fantasize that you're not in a city when you're there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was
And that's right in the center of the park?
Pretty much in the exact center of the park.
How could anyone like Jack be so intellectual and be so emotionally unaware at the same time?
Oh,
I mean, I know there are people like that, but how did this happen to him?
Oh, him in particular?
Yes.
Because there are certainly people like that. I think you take a character who's bookish and has an intellectual bent and is not as adept at knowing how to relate to people. And if that person has a passion for books and the truth in books, he can get more and more into that book world and withdraw more and more from learning how to deal with the so-called real world.
How did you stumble on Jack? You had a lot of choice of characters. I mean, he is so striking in a way that I almost felt, I said, she must have known somebody like this. And probably not. He was probably a straight fictional character. But how did you stumble on Jack?
He is a straight fictional character, but I have taken pieces of other people for him. And he simply came to me. I was fascinated with the idea of someone whose solitude was taken to an extreme. I was just drawn to writing that story. And he's an exaggeration of things I've seen in other people and people that I've known.
Now, that's interesting because there are two groups that are very solid, very much alone in this book. One of the Buddhist monks with whom he ends up living for a while, and him. And his solitude is diseased, I think we can say, whereas the Buddhist monks seem to be quite the opposite. So were you trying to set up that kind of opposition there?
That's a really interesting point. It's actually something I've never thought about. You brought me, that's wonderful. I like that. There is a comparison there, and now that you pointed out, I think that's true. The Buddhist solitaries are not unaware of the outside world. They've simply chosen for particular reasons to separate themselves and not always separate themselves permanently. And they are choosing to be solitude to emphasize certain parts of their lives and to make certain connections. Whereas Jack's solitude is more a safety mechanism. It's a way to be safe, it's a way to have sameness and control.
And is this book symbolic in a way of the other Jacks living in a large urban environment like New York?
I really only set out to write about one character, one person that came to me and that I tried to inhabit as fully as I could. But I do think there are many Jacks in any city. I think there are Jacks in Maplewood and South Orange. I've been told that there are. I was speaking to a cafe owner once who got familiar with my book, and she said, you know, there's a man like that who comes in every day and he spends his 50 cents on his tea and he doesn't seem to have any anywhere you go, there are people like Jack.
It's interesting because when Jack does try to reach out to other people, he literally doesn't know what to do. And that's from the time he was young. So you're saying in a way, or I took it, and maybe I took it wrongly, that perhaps he might have been partially born this way, unlike his parents who were very sociable. How did you take that when you were writing about him? Did you see him as being born that way, or just sort of growing that way from very early age?
I think both. We all have our innate constitutions, and I saw him as a character that had an innate love of solitude and a sort of different drummer kind of mentality, but also it's clear through the book that he grows up in a lot of silence, that his parents are quite absent, and that he doesn't have a lot of connections as a child. And so I think it's both, you know, the old genetics environment debate, well, I think it's both for him.
Well, his parents were very much social butterflies. That would be fair to say, wouldn't it? and his mother, when she goes up to the country when he's young, sits in the tub all day and reads trashy novels. I found that to be quite amusing. And she doesn't seem to really relate to him. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, yes. And there's depression. She's a depressed person. She comes alive when she's on stage, which I think can be true of actors. Obviously, it's not true of all actors, but she has a love of show and of being on display and of presenting her art publicly, but as a private person, she's withdrawn. So it doesn't come out of nowhere what Jack is.
It's really observing his mother and his father, who's away taking care of his theaters all the time. Right. What does Jack's story tell us about ourselves?
You know, I think that's something for every reader to decide. The most I would dare to say is I think most of us have some piece of ourself that strives for connection and doesn't quite know how to make it, or that craves solitude and fears it also. I think those are pretty universal things. So if people can read the book and get any of that out of it, I'll be satisfied, and I hope it resonates in that way.
Do you fear in a way that Jack is so off-putting initially when you start that people might just sort of close the book and say, gee, I don't know that I can last with this fellow?
I did fear that, most definitely, when I was going through drafts. And I think in my initial drafts, people did respond more that way. That was the feedback I got when I had an earlier manuscript. And I think my task was to go deeper and deeper into his life and the specifics of his needs and his environment. And I think the more you go into the particulars of a human being, the more approachable they are for readers, the more readers can relate. Even you don't have to necessarily like someone or approve of them or be like them, but you can relate and identify a little bit if you see all the true specifics of their lives on the page. And so the more I was able to deepen him, the more I began to get a response that maybe people didn't like Jack, but they were interested, and that's enough.
Okay, and we have to take a break, and when we do and come back, I'd like to talk about Jack and the book in a little bit more.
Thanks.
We'll be back.
Faster than searching the World Wide Web. More inspiring than a half-cap mocha latte. Able to answer any question with insight and detail. This superhero of knowledge can find the answer to any question no matter what the problem. And she works in your neighborhood at your public library. When you need to know, get to know your library. Log on to njlibraries.org.
Welcome back to Books in Action. We're talking with Pamela Erens, former editor of a women's magazine, author of a new novel called The Understory. And we were talking about Jack, Frederick Ronan Gorse, who is a very unusual character, a shut-in, and a person who is not appealing except that he is. And you were talking just before the break that you went more deeply in detail to get people to stay with him, to stick with him. Is that really what makes him so captivating ultimately, is just the incredible detail about him?
It's the detail. I think also he's a person of strong opinions and strong needs, and any character who has strong desires, I think, pulls us in, whether those desires are savory, unsavory, ours, desires we could never think of having. That makes for force on the page. So I think it's a combination of all those things, and I think he has his own voice. It's a first-person novel, and he has his own way of speaking, and hopefully you get drawn into that.
He's a bit of a fantasist, though. He walks his way down. He's getting thrown out of his apartment that he never should have been in the first place, and he's walking down to housing court, and he's imagining what he's going to tell the judge, and it's just completely beyond the pale. Now, he was trained as an attorney, right? He was trained as a lawyer. He started off doing trust and estates, if I seem to recall, and he gives that up in a year. So he really does know better, but he's going through this wonderful, fantastic argument that turns out is, of course, nowhere close to reality. What's going on there?
What's going on there? I see him, and I am fond of him, and I see him as someone who so wants to hold on to what he sees as the truth of the situation, and he's so idealistic in a way that he feels if he gets up in front of a judge and tells him all the wonderful reasons why a man like him, who is a reader and intellectual and wants to devote himself to truth and beauty, should be basically given an apartment in New York City. And there's a part of me that believes that. Can't we support these kinds of wonderful ideals in the world? But of course the world doesn't work that way, and so the book doesn't work that way, and the judge isn't going to work that way.
The judge takes care of it with real dispatch.
Right, right.
If you summarize Jack in one word or sentence, what would that be?
Longing. I think he's someone who longs. He longs for truth, he longs for knowledge, he longs for connection, and he's driven by those needs. He longs for comfort and safety. And so many of his decisions and so many of his rituals are shaped around trying to taste a bit of what he needs out of life.
So why does he suddenly think he has an avenue when he meets the young architect who comes to look at the building that's going to be gutted and refurbished that he's living in? What is the trigger there?
I don't have a perfect answer. Again, I hoped it would be suggestive rather than black and white. But he's 40 years old. He's just had his 40th birthday. There's a scene where he has actually passed his birthday and didn't notice it, and he's brought up with a shock. My goodness, I'm 40. There's that sense of aging and feeling alone. And I think it's decades of built-up need. And it's a crisis. As we all know, a crisis, he's being threatened with eviction. A crisis can bring out needs and headier emotions than we're used to experiencing. It can make us vulnerable. And I think he's vulnerable at this moment for all those reasons.
So the architect's really a target of opportunity.
In a way. But he's also a nice man.
Yes, he is.
And a handsome man.
Yes.
And a sensitive man.
Okay. The detail that Jack reveals about himself, it really is extraordinary throughout the book. I was astonished. You really captured him in tiny detail. How did you achieve that in 142 pages? It's really a novella more than a novel, and yet you were able to somehow grasp all that. It took you a long time to write this book?
Yes, yes, it did. Well, I have a funny answer to that, the question of how in 142 pages. The first draft of this book was 260 pages, and it took me a lot of revision to make it that short. So for me, it was a process of winnowing and getting out everything that I felt was inessential, and I really wanted to distill it to only what absolutely needed to be on the page.
Well, you achieved it mightily. Being a writer myself, I was reading from page to page, and I was just amazed. I mean, my congratulations to you on that. Where do his obsessions come from? His fixed daily routine, is that just part of his shut-in nature, or is that something else going on there? Because he has a lot of them.
Right. I saw that as his love of sameness and comfort and safety. I saw him as a person who has a lot of fear. He wants to connect, like we all want to connect, but he's afraid, in the way we all are, of rejection, of aloneness, of disruption. And I saw him as building up these obsessions and routines, these very rigid routines, as a way of handling the chaos of life, and also of giving himself the space to do what he really does love. It's not all negative. He loves books. He loves meditation, his own kind of meditation, not the Buddhist kind of meditation. And his simplifying of his life. We all do know that if you simplify your life, you can make space for more things that you care about, and it's partly that too.
So how did he get off looking for twins?
Where do the twins come in?
I mean, he's constantly looking for twins,
Right,
and
right.
it really doesn't seem to relate to anything else.
It
He just
doesn't
It's like a
really.
tick. I mean,
It's not intimately bound up with the rest of the book, except that, again, it's that love of, it's that fascination with sameness. I don't know if you remember, there's a passage where he thinks about snowflakes, and we're always all told that no two snowflakes are alike, and he's insistent that there must be two snowflakes alike. He has to believe that, because he loves sameness, he loves repetition, and I saw that as just part of his character. And I think it's also speaks to, he has his own desire to find some kind of companion, and I think a man like Jack would most easily picture a companion as someone almost identical to him, because difference is very threatening.
And then I think one of the more interesting parts of the book is when he goes to a Buddhist monastery after he leaves the city, and his apartment is essentially burned out in a faulty electrical fire, I guess. And he falls into doing bonsai. And I thought to myself, you must have done some bonsai somewhere to be able to write these passages, because they were really, it was almost like a textbook accurate. Is that something that you've actually done, or was
It's
this?
not something I've actually done, but I love bonsai. I love to look at them. They're fascinating to me and sort of horrifying, and I think that perhaps came out in the book. There's something very odd about crippling these trees and stunting their growth and so forcefully shaping them, yet they come out beautifully. They're an unbelievably beautiful type of plant, and it's a real art. I did a lot of research, but I enjoy them as a spectator, and yes, those were fun parts to write.
Is the bonsai, the working with the control of nature that you use in bonsai, where you wire the limbs of the tree and you cut the roots and you pot them very specifically, is that almost an analogy to the way that Jack is? Forcing control on his world?
Analogy might be too strict a word, but I think there are resonances there. Certainly Jack is a controlled person. Jack is a person who wants to shape his world. And the same themes come up with bonsai and in a monastery. I mean, what more controlled environment is there than a monastery? So the novel plays with a lot of these themes of control, of nature, of order, of growth and fertility, and so they move through the different aspects of the book.
Now, he meets a monk in the monastery. I don't think I can pronounce his name. Is it Jaiku?
Joku.
Joku, who is a former psychotherapist who has basically, I guess, dropped out, if you would say, of the world. And yet, it seems like he almost maybe can possibly relate to Joku, but he never really does. What's going on there?
What's going on there? I think Joku is another sympathetic yet distant figure, like the architect, like perhaps his parents. There is that trying to come close, and Joku has his own reasons for staying distant. He has people he has to be responsible to. Jack is not really a seeker in the monastery. He's not there for, shall we say, the right reasons. And
he's hiding, really.
He's hiding. So I saw him as a potential bridge to the outside world, which he is in some ways. Joku's instrumental in helping Jack make a step or two that become clear later in the book and affect the outcome.
Well, we're running out of time, so I want to make sure that everyone knows where they can buy the book. Is it available in the local bookstores?
It's available in the local bookstores, Goldfinch bookstores, on Amazon, and other bookstores on request.
Okay. And it's Ironweed Press, which is an independent press.
Yes.
And how long did it take you to write it?
It took me 2 years to write the initial version and 2 years to make that shorter version I told you about.
And that's in between taking kids to school and everything else that you have to do?
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing that you can do this. And I understand you have a website.
I have a website.
Could you possibly give that as well?
Sure. It's www.pamela.erens.com.
Okay. And that's fine. And once again, the book is called The Understory, and it is a fascinating examination of a person who really is locked within himself and is struggling to get out, but just doesn't know how to do it. And when he makes the attempt, he tragically, basically wrecks it. I think we can say that accurately. It's well worth reading. And I must say that I enjoyed it immensely. I thought it was extraordinarily well written, and as I say, I cared for somebody that I didn't think I ever could care for. So
That's good.
It's amazing that you were able to pull that off. Do you have another book in the works?
I have just started one, and eager to move along.
Is it anything similar like this?
It's very different.
Very different.
Very different.
Well, that's great. We've been talking with Pamela Erens, the author of The Understory, and I want to thank you for watching Books in Action. I'm Jim Horton. It's very good.
Thank you.